everyone. Guess what? Producer Steph and I are here.
Hello.
Say hi, Steph.
Hello, hello.
Like I put you in a backyard. I'm like, say hi, Steph. Like, was that horrible mother?
It's like, smile for the photo. Smile for the photo.
Say please. Say thank you. Anyway, we have some very exciting bonus content for you all. We recently connected with the founders of the Mashup Americans, Amy S. Choi and Rebecca Lehrer. And we had this phone call. We were just, trying to say hello and talk about our projects. And we ended up in this 30-minute discussion about hope and grief. And Steph and I were like, oh my God, we have to just chat about all this stuff. And then the next, somebody yelled out bonus content. It was probably me. And here we are.
Definitely.
So we wanted to say welcome you two.
Welcome.
Thank you. Hello.
Sometimes we say thank you at the same time, like weird little twins.
Cute.
That's what happens when you run a business together. Tell us a little bit about yourself, each of you.
I'm Amy. The way I mash up is I am a first-generation Korean American. I'm the first person in my family to be born in the United States. I am married to a first-generation Colombian Mexican American, and I have two Korean, Colombian, Mexican kids here in Brooklyn, but it is fundamental to me that I grew up in the Midwest and I have some very Midwestern tendencies. But yeah, Rebecca and I found each other at a point where we were like, what are all of these hyphens? And they are so important to us. And so, Mashup was born.
Yeah. You can't see because that's the medium we're in, but I'm sitting in my children's room. It's a lot happening. It's a visual mess. My name is Rebecca Lehrer, and I am a Salvadoran Jewish Angelino. And Amy and I started the Mashup Americans nearly 10 years, in 2013. And we're coming on our 10th anniversary to sort of explore all the hyphens of our identities. Woo! I know. You are entrepreneurs. You understand it's a big deal to
That's a huge deal.
Have a business that still exists. Especially one that you invented. So that feels cool. And really it's about, both of us are first generation, even though our families' immigrant stories are really different. Actually, there's so much interconnected about the questions that we have about ourselves, about what it means to belong, about the amount of guilt we have. And Amy and I met through my husband. They were high school best friends.
Aww.
And so we met years ago when we were asking a lot of questions about what it meant to marry somebody different from ourselves and raise children and what do you call them? What names do we give kids and what traditions do you think about and what foods are you introducing? And so that's the genesis of it. And now 10 years later, have this studio where we're telling stories, both our own and other folks, about just led with this sort of deep curiosity.
That's fantastic. So we have obviously adjusting. The whole point is to have some a fun energy while you talk about self-helpy sort of stuff. And, we like to say we're not your NPR, but there's real crossover in the grief project. And what made you start a project just entirely focused on grief?
I think it's probably similar to the roots of yours, and I'd love to hear that. But I think for us, it was realizing acutely in sort of the spring of 2020 as COVID was ravaging. Amy is based in New York and I'm based in LA. So just those first few months, particularly in New York, being how are we not talking about the amount of literal death there is? We passed, I remember, the 100,000 human beings in America dead. And there was barely any, there was no mourning, there was no public understanding of it or acknowledgement really of it. It was also the government that was in place, and it almost felt like a manifestation, like an actual illness that felt to us almost like what the last 4 years before that had felt like in our bodies and minds as well. I don't know how to express that in a different way, but we had experienced so much loss. We were all so on edge, so depleted, and it felt so inhumane and so targeted. And then to additionally add this layer of real sickness and dying and grief. And it felt like an awareness that, particularly as Americans, it's something that we are not addressing, we're not equipped to talk about, we're not equipped to like, there's no rituals. We love to move forward and never actually deal with the shit that has happened or acknowledge, try to learn from it.
Yeah.
And not to be like grief has to be productive. That's not the answer. It's more that by metabolizing grief, by processing it, you learn to live with it rather than pretend it didn't happen and then have it metastasize.
Right.
And, the Black Lives Matter protests of 2020 and the revelations even for all of us, that the world many of us that we had kind of thought was there is actually not really the world that is there. And there's a loss there too. So I think it was really the 2020 clarified for us that grief and loss at its many layers, both death loss and grief from death, but also community grief and cultural grief and ancestral grief, that all of these are things that we have personally experienced, we watch our community experience, and we just felt like and feel like having the conversation about it instead of being afraid of it and pushing it away gives us an opportunity to build the future we want rather than being mired in like pretending something away and then actually being stuck in it. And I think that's a sort of big picture. And then again, with this show and the season of it's, an extension of all of the Mashup Americans work. It's not prescriptive. We're really not trying to tell anybody how to grieve. It's more just understanding. And sometimes, and Amy can speak more to this because I think she articulates it so beautifully, but there was something about talking to experts about like, this isn't a show where we're talking about people's personal grief stories because there's beautiful shows like that exist that we love and we listen to and our friends make. But it was about like, let's talk to some experts. Like what happens in your body when you grieve, to remind ourselves that like we didn't make it up. Like in this world of like untruth or alternate truth facts. What was the fucking thing?
It was alternate facts.
Alternate facts in this world where like science has no meaning. Apparently, like we're like, actually, these are studyable things because being human is loving and being human is grieving and being human is dying. So we can learn from them. I don't know, Amy, anything you want to?
Well, I think, there is so much of like Rebecca and my's work, and which is always driven by our own curiosity and like our personal obsessions, that when it came to grief, and we had very different personal histories with grief, which you learn a little bit about in the show, but just that the things that we were experiencing and observing in ourselves and our communities and our families, we felt like we knew them, right? And like we could see it in other people and we could see the patterns and like there's some things that, you just like know in your soul. But what we were able to do with Grief Collected was pursue those questions with experts and just get them validated, to understand that there are scientists and neurophysicists and professors at the most revered institutions in America that have like longitudinal studies on grief that can tell us that like, yes, this is the hardest thing that you will experience. And know that it's not just you feeling like this is the hardest thing you have ever experienced, that this is validating, that like when you have insomnia or you're throwing up all the time after like a friend has died, that's not you losing your mind. That's not you like as an individual failing to like get through it or to get by or to like get over it. It is actually your body communicating with itself. It's like your limbic system saying you are in distress, and that these are things that happen to all humans and also all animals, that these are like essential parts of living. And it took for us like a lot of the often what can feel like a little bit, and we're pretty like woo girls, like we can get into it. Like Rebecca has like a titanium crystal vaccinated woo-woos.
Just
We're like real
really
shotted
clear,
up
like
woo-woos.
what are the most, how many
You
more?
could just say you
how
live
many
in LA.
more
I
kids?
feel like that's like implied.
But I just want to make sure everyone understands. It means like hyper boosted science
like
woo-woos.
science woo-woos. And also, like I'm first generation Korean American. I grew up with a lot of Chinese medicine. Like my mom was doing acupuncture when she sprained her wrist like in the 80s, like which a lot of people here still think of as very woo-woo. But
yeah,
when people speak about like the body-mind connection or the emotional state or like the real emotional or kind of like spiritual journeys that grief, this like monumental feelings can foist onto you or like force you into, it can feel very woo-woo. And then you're like, well, but what is it really? Or like, again, it becomes this like individual thing that you have to like solve for.
Yeah.
Like I have to get over this, or I have to fix my insomnia, or like I just need to be less sad and like get more sunshine or vitamin D or whatever. And it actually turns out, no, like your body needs to do these things. And speaking to experts kind of on all levels, and we did speak to spiritual experts and we did speak to artists and we also spoke to scientists and scholars. And it was so just validating in every way to learn that this human experience that seems so kind of impossible is actually possible and researched and studied. And it felt very empowering.
I think also like just to build off that, like, I mean, I'm Canadian, but I'm going to lump Canadians in with Americans and just pretend I'm American for this conversation.
I think that's
like,
right in this context.
Yeah,
fair enough.
Yeah.
There's just like no understanding of like your body and your like there's no tie between emotions, body, and like sickness. Whereas I think like most other cultures and places in the world have that like relationship in some way, whether it's spiritual or through like traditional medicine. And I think understanding that like body part of it, at least for me, was mind blowing because I was like, it was that affirmingness of it. Like I was like, oh, I'm not like losing my mind. I am like physically experiencing things because I am emotionally experiencing things, and those things are linked together. And like those symptoms that are physical are gonna, calm down if I learn how to like harness my emotions and, deal with them healthily instead of just being like, oh, it's fine.
Well, and like in addition to like what Steph's saying, like you were all talking about that like cultural thing that's handed down, like patterns. And I do think that we have this real, as a country, this real like pick yourself up by your bootstraps. Like you should be fine. You should be fixed. You should be back at work. And it's like that keeps you stuck. And then the body stuff comes up. Like it is all connected if you don't. And Amy, you were talking about like the woo-woo factor. And it's like, we have like a cultural shame attached to exploring your feelings and processing stuff. Like, who are you to take the time to, you should just fix it and move on. Be grateful you have food or money or whatever.
Well, I mean, that's a huge chunk of it. And even just thinking about, I mean, we have a lot of jokes in it, but like, just American ways of being. And one of the things that we were talking to Adrienne Marie Brown, who's one of our like heroines. So it's just a joy to use these opportunities to get to talk to people you're excited to talk to. It's one of our big cons that we're pulling in life. But, we were talking about just this sense of an American, the U.S., and I'd love to hear if there's a Canadian parallel here, but there's the narrative we tell. Storytelling is hugely important. And it's hugely important actually to grieving. It's something we learned from the psychologists, like being together and telling stories. They have an impact on your body and on your grieving process. But the other piece of that is that the American mythologizing, American myth making about what it means to be America. We've been this way. We are this way. This is what it is. And no willingness to adjust to that or to realize that it's
love it or leave it.
In the grand scheme of culture and history, it's like 2 minutes old, and we were joking about how like you go anywhere else in the world and they'll be like, this random bar is 500 years old. Or like, you're just like in a countryside in France, which isn't even the oldest place with the oldest shit. And everything is way older than anything in post-indigenous, post-destruction of native culture America. And there's this funny game that people do where you read the news of America, the American news of other places, and then if you read about America the way that we talk about other places, and you're like the nonsense that's happening in the Speaker of the House, all this stuff that's happening. And if you were anywhere else, we would talk about it with a totally different set of languages. So that's the piece about Americanness, which is we're also very much American. You know, we might be hyphenated or first generation, but we are of this place. I mean, we are, and we're swimming in it. And so it's this mix of stuff for us that I think is part of what the mashup alchemy is, which is that we're in it, we're of it. We're also able to ask some questions because we have a little bit of information or something in us that is like, this doesn't maybe have to be this way. And I think one of those things that, to your point, to both of you, is that this idea and the pandemic, you couldn't be with people. You couldn't be in real life. You were terrified of your body. You're terrified of getting sick. You're terrified of making other people sick. And yet you want to be human with other people together. And grieving requires community. Grieving the loss of a future you thought, or grieving a person, requires being with the people who loved that person, the people of that community. And it's been fucking weird and hard to be so. I mean, Steph, I don't know if you are still in Canada or you.
Oh no,
I'm in
Brooklyn.
Okay, so you're in Brooklyn, but your family might be in Canada. Like, to even our families are all over the world. Like, to not get to be with them, the level of isolation and pulling apart has been a level of loss as well.
Yeah, there was like a grieving that needed to happen coming out of, well, if we have in fact come out of COVID, like who the hell knows if we're in it or out of it. But there's like a grieving that happened with that as well. I felt so trapped. Like I was like, and there was a loss of my independence and friends and all of that. And I mean, there were some things that were good that I shed. Like I'm an overcommitter. And so I was able to like see less people. And that was actually very good for me. But the rest of it, we aren't acknowledging what we went through as a
100%.
as a global.
100%.
Wait, I love that use of shed versus loss. I haven't heard that. And I like that distinction there. Like the things you shed that, because it's not silver lining-y, which isn't our vibe.
Yeah.
But like, you shed things that weren't serving you, but then that doesn't mean there wasn't also a lot of big losses.
Yeah. And I also think that like not acknowledging those losses is also, that's so much part of like our American grief denial. And the need, like the real impulse, like almost desperate impulse to get back to the way things were, which I completely understand. And also what we saw was that the way things were so fragile and not good in so many ways. But confronting that requires confronting our grief over both the way that things were and also how poorly managed the pandemic was by like all of our institutions. But we need to do that in order to like make the next better thing. But our imaginations are currently stuck at getting back to the way things were because we refuse to acknowledge all of that. And like it just like can't face it. And I think that that's the part that, a lot of people kind of in the past couple months have asked Rebecca and I, like, you guys are both so like, why grief? Like this is generally our vibe. Like we're like hanging out, we're like talking about happy. And it's because like, I think for us, like grappling with it and trying to access what so many people said, all of these experts, was like a healthy expression of grief. And then because we are both American type A nerds, we were like, but what is that? And like, can you tell us? And what are the steps? But being able to live with our grief and understand it and like get our arms around it was really a way of like getting free of it in some way, or not, maybe not getting free of the grief, but getting free of like whatever that stuckness was that grief gives you. Adrienne Marie Brown says, if you don't have the opportunity to metabolize your grief, then the grief becomes your shape. And I think we all know people for whom that has been true. I see that in like family members. I think one of the undercurrents of motivation / fear maybe that Rebecca and I have is that like this is the shape that like our culture will take. Like the grief is now shaped like our whole everything. I'm making motions, guys, with my arms. Big circular ones.
She is now making well, and I worry too that we reverted to our base level. We got like very Lord of the Flies and just started fighting. And we were already sort of set up for that coming into it. I think, politically as a country and as, we're very separated right now. But I think that just made it worse. And everything became, I'm on this side, you're on that side. You wear this mask, that puts you over there. I'm doing this, that puts me over here. And it was the opposite of what I thought we all should have been doing, which is talking more, coming together, looking for collective hope. Yeah. We did none of that. We were all like, get away from me. I'm cleaning my groceries. We just did not, as a culture, I just don't feel like we handled it very well.
When having that lack of community, lack of conversation, just taking that parallel and being like what happened with toilet paper, at the beginning of the pandemic, it's so everyone for themselves. And I can't think of a more dark, caricature of what that looks like than that moment in history where people were just I need this toilet paper for me.
And to be fair, people were looking out for themselves because we had no trust that anybody else was going to look out for us. In a lot of ways, we were right.
Yeah.
And that's
definitely
real fucking bummer.
That's a whole other level of grief where it's how do I accept that I can't change entire systems, but also accept living within the system when you're forced up against so many clear examples time after time after time after time that it's not working for you or serving you at all.
I mean, that's a big part of what we talk about in our show. It's just again, grieving either a future you thought or a system you thought that even if it doesn't really serve you, it's the one you know. Mm-hmm. And I think, that can feel heady, but it's actually in everything, right? Exactly that. No one's delivering packages with, toilet paper and minimum necessities to everyone's home during the pandemic, right? That was not happening. And so we had to do that. Luckily, part of my ancestral grief is that I anticipate the worst things all the time. So I was a month ahead. I mean, you can't imagine that. I would just casually buy you know what? I'm hearing this thing. I'm going to get 10 more cans and some Lysol wipes or whatever.
I had people straight up grocery shopping in my apartment because I was out of city and then they closed the borders between the provinces. So I couldn't get back to my house. And I had people living in my apartment and going there, not buying, they just took it obviously, but would go and get flour and chickpeas and stuff because I live I live like my nana who was wartime Italian.
My wife is a catastrophe type person, and so she was going on and on and on about how we needed all these dry goods, and I am always that person who's everything is going to be fine. This is blowing over. Aww. You're not losing your job. Meanwhile, she worked in Broadway advertising. Her job was gone in 4 seconds. I was like, oh
my God.
And I was all right, so I was wrong, and I'm super glad we have all the lentils now.
Thank you for the canned goods.
But it's funny because when you were talking about the grief thing, we talked about this I think once or twice on Well Adjusting. But my old therapist, who was one of our experts, Patricia, said that when someone dies, you experience their death, but then you also experience the death of the idea of who you thought they could be. So in my case, I had a parent who was not so amazing. And so when she died, I had to process her death, but then I also had to process the idea of who I hoped she could, maybe someday she would get to. And I think sometimes that lost that idea, and taking it to what we're talking about, that idea of like what you were saying, Amy, about the old way we lived is not, everything's different now. We have a new normal, but we have to grieve both those things in order to step into the new normal. And I think that's where the stuck thing comes in too. If you don't do that, if you pretend it's not happening, how can you move forward?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and there's so many different types of loss. That's such a great example of it. And I would say I talked a little bit about fertility stuff and having miscarriages.
Yep.
That I was never like, this is a baby. Everyone has their own thing, but I was like, this is some cells that are making me nauseous or whatever, my boob's sore. But when those miscarriages happened, it was the loss of a future I thought was happening.
Yeah.
It was the loss of a life becoming a parent in that way at that time. And that was a real grieving that I had to do.
And no one talks about miscarriages.
Yeah,
Right.
I was just gonna say.
And you're really grieving. It's grieving. And again, I wasn't grieving a baby. Like that's sometimes it's like you can't see my posture, but it makes me stressed out to think about it that way. It's not my experience of it. It's not how I felt it. I was grieving the life I thought was starting in January of the next year. It was like this thing, and not knowing, and the unknowingness of not knowing how I would become a parent when that was something really important to me.
Yeah.
Dorothy Hollinger, who we have on the pod, who wrote The Anatomy of Grief, which we highly recommend as a book about grief in the body and a lot of this science stuff. And Amy can tell you about grief in animals. It's wild. But there's all these different types of losses, like, anticipatory loss. Let's say if you have somebody who's sick in your family for a long time, or Alzheimer's, dementia, those kinds of losses where you're already grieving while the person is still there. There's these other ones, complicated grief. This grief when you're like, what you said it nicely, I think your mother was not such a good parent or whatever. It was even more, not the best. I have friends who've lost parents that they were estranged from, and that they heard like 3 hand removed that this parent died, but they're still grieving that loss.
Yeah.
And that there was never a relationship that was mended, even though this person was a piece of shit who they never wanted to mend a relationship with. But they still have to,
Now that possibility is gone. That possibility is gone. And that's hard.
Exactly.
I think Linda Tai talks about it as well. She is a somatic therapist that really walked us through ancestral grief and family grief. And, she really speaks to everything that you're saying, Robin, is that, something that really stuck with me and that has been a big challenge for me in my life is she was like, particularly in the context of mashups and families who have migrated, but this is pertinent to anybody whose parents weren't like the awesomest, was just that like you also grieve what you deserved and that you never got to have. And as you even learn more about that, and like maybe like as you have your own children, what you give to them, and that you maybe start to realize you never got. And she says this thing that just like blew us out of the water, which is that you deserve to be delighted in.
Aww.
And if you weren't, that's actually worthy of grieving, and that those layers get revealed over time. And to me, I think a big part of the work, both in this particular project and also just in life, is to be like, okay, grieving that is hard and it's fucking sad. And it's also good because now I know. And like now you know that you are worthy of more of that, and that's something that you can like pursue in your life. For me, I feel like the more that we open our eyes or like can acknowledge or like experience the most wonderful things is when you're like, okay, well this was always a possibility, this like amazing thing here. So like it sucks that I didn't have that, or that I had the opposite of that. But then you can grieve that. Feeling like that is available feels really transformative. And it feels like, I think people right now, it's like a very, I don't know, TikTok psychology thing to be like, I'm healing my inner child. But I'm like, also, I'm healing my fucking inner child, and like, I think that's great. And everybody should.
But maybe not from TikTok. Maybe not
from TikTok. No.
Well, that's when Amy became a QAnon wellness influencer on TikTok.
Oh.
There's probably big
Yeah,
money
that's
in
our
that.
next business plan.
I'm super primed for it. Don't worry, guys.
Do you think in general, like in the process of doing the podcast, I know that you were talking to like experts, not necessarily like talking to individuals, but like you guys are in the mix with the people. Are you feeling like people are more hopeful today or less hopeful? Like what are your feelings?
Oh, wow. Well, I'm going to flip it on you because I need to know if you are. I think my observation and the people around me is that people are clearer.
Mm.
People are in their own individual lives are focusing on gratitude a lot more,
Yeah.
I think, generally. And also, like, what am I going to do in my own life, in my own community to have impact? And some of the bigger stuff, which is, I think that's how you make change. But some of the, like, watching this stuff in Hollywood, I live in LA and I'm like in Hollywood. No, in Washington, D.C., it just feels like far away.
Yeah.
And in a way that didn't feel that way. I think I haven't thought more about it until this moment. So it's a good question, but that's something I'm observing. I think people are just like, my God, we just got to be together on New Year's.
Yes.
Like there's something that there's a little bit of how amazing is this? And maybe it's emerging or I don't know. I think we probably have fairly self-aware. I mean, you know, I only talk to people who go to therapy, but I think that there's some awareness of the level of loss that's happened. Everyone has different abilities to deal or confront grief or complicated shit. But I think there's some kind of just sitting in that and, again, that gratitude.
Yeah.
I don't know. Amy, what do you think?
Yeah, I would agree. I think that people I know feel very hopeful on a very micro level.
Yeah.
I think a past me, like a younger me, would have thought that was kind of selfish or kind of depressing to think about. But I have very much changed my point of view on that. And I really do believe in this idea that, like, if the tiny little parts, like the atoms, aren't healthy and thriving, then, like, in what possible universe can the whole be thriving? And, like, we're all, so if we all just focus a little bit on, like, being happier and healthier and more honest with, like, and also in relationship to each other, that can only possibly help mend the whole.
Yeah.
So I feel hopeful about that. I don't know that people are, like, looking around at the world and feeling more hopeful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's see. There's a war, inflation,
Yeah.
global pandemic. Everything is fabulous.
Recession.
Yeah. Recession. Exactly.
Yeah. I think, like, for a lot of people, in the pandemic was sort of the first time. I mean, like, I talked to my siblings about this, right? I was, like, always sick as a kid, and I have OCD, so I'm, like, very familiar washing my groceries. Like, I am, like, I was, like, very prepared for the pandemic in a sick way that I don't recommend.
You know what?
For
Your
anyone.
sickness served you.
Yes.
Exactly.
But I think for a lot of people, like, it was one of the first experiences where you're forced to care about people, like, community, you know, people that walk through life, you know, not afraid that they're going to die.
What must that
For
be
the
like?
first time, it was like, yeah, I know, right? But, like, for the first time, they were like, oh, I could seriously die.
Yeah.
You know what? So, first of all, sorry, I won't cry. Something that also breaks my heart about those things, I'm trying, in the United States at least, or at least how it feels in media, and this might be another conversation, is about part of this conversation is, like, how isolating it feels to only be engaging with people through, like, the lens of, like, a news story or social media versions of it. And so it feels like everyone's just a fucking asshole. But how momentary that felt, at least in the US, and suddenly people are like, oh yeah, but now I don't care because you're infringing on my rights as an able-bodied, cisgendered white man. And I think I'm like, fuck
that was
your
the
rights.
disappointing part of people.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the part which I'm trying not to, as a human, I don't generally get caught in those, but I think it's one of my great heartbreaks and losses of this time is that I really love people and I really believe in people. And I know there's a lot of assholes, but I do believe that, like, generally people want to have a good life and want people around them to have a good life. And maybe they don't know that there are people who are different from them, but that are also deserve good lives. They just get caught in an idea of something. But once they know them, I do believe those barriers would come down. Like, I have a strong belief in that. But like, I don't know. There's just something sometimes that's part of something that I'm still grieving, I think.
You know, what's so interesting about what both of you two are saying, and it's around what Steph's saying about the small movements or around the clarity. You know, it's like if I start catastrophizing and I start talking about like us versus them and our democracy is broken, and if I start going into all those places and I can't believe people that I thought I knew are doing these types of things, like as soon as I start going there, well, then I have no hope at all. But if I come into the small things, and it just made me think, I'm just fresh off of like a New Year's Eve weekend with my 3 best friends from college. So they're my sisters, they're my people. And we did this thing where we got together and we called it the bowl of activities. And everyone had to show up with 10 activities. And they could be a question. It could be you take a walk. It could be you do a Jell-O shot. It could be anything you wanted to put into it. And
Jell-O shot. These are your college friends.
These are my college
friends. I see what's happening here.
But everybody put in more than 10. And what we did is the whole weekend, whenever the momentum of one thing died, somebody goes, all right, whose turn is it? You reached in, you grabbed it. Everybody had one veto. But other than that, you had to do what was in the bowl. And the most incredible things showed up, like people putting questions, like the second day we started off with a Bloody Mary. And the question was, look at everyone in the room and tell them something about them that you admire or you love. And then it moved into like a meditation. And then the next one was go play Foursquare. And then we were playing this very committed Foursquare game. Like we were all like, do we put bras on for this? I think we do. Let's go in the rain. And it ended up being such a beautiful weekend where we were all just open and connected. And one of the questions was, finish the sentence. I declare the year of 2023 to be ... And everyone sat, and we sat for like an hour and a half talking about what we wanted to live into this year. And, you know, and all of those things, from the Jell-O shots that happened to these deep questions, were small things that brought us together. And I just, it's hokey to say, but like, I believe that that's where the change is going to occur, is in these small things and in these human connections and in deep conversations.
I agree.
Me too.
I don't know. Did we just fix the world? Did we? I think we might have.
Well, I mean, I think for us in 2023, that's very much along the lines of as we've been thinking about what we want as a team, me and Amy, is like, how do we, you know, if I'm in New York in March, what are we all doing together? Like, are we going to have a dinner that we come and then we invite a few other people and we ask one question? And that is a way of connecting for an hour with a group of people. I believe that that's it. One of the things that this Dr. George Bonanno, the person we asked what the fuck is grief to, less colorfully, we're like, can you, I'm like, what is it? But he runs the Center for Grief, Loss, and Trauma at Columbia. And, you know, one of the things we talked about was technology, like always feeling like it's the worst possible time, like everything we're experiencing. And he was saying he thought technology and the way we get information and the way even news is, the way algorithms kind of put value on one way of doing things, right? So like it's inflaming, right? That inflammation gets you more engaged. And that's the way the monetization has been structured thus far. And so, but one of the things he said, and he's like, I'm hopeful of, which I appreciate. He was like, we are not equipped as humans in our brains to get information in the way that we are now. And so therefore everything feels like it's the worst that's ever been.
Yeah.
But hoping that
okay,
that's not the hopeful
She's about
part.
to turn a corner. She's turning.
The hopeful bit is that we will figure it out on how to get it, because we have to for our survival, really, because our brains are not equipped. I mean, if you think about in our lifetimes, I mean, my husband and I'm not that old. I'm in my early 40s. We got our first smartphones together you know, in 2008. So that's like in my adulthood. And I got it because I was in graduate school and all these other people had them. And they were like, there would be some opportunity would come up during a class, like a lunch with someone really interesting, and people would all be filled up. And I was like, how did you even know that had happened? But anyways, that's actually hopeful to me. I just believe that we're still in this a revolutionary moment. And if we can almost embrace that and have like a longer term view of whether it's the future we live in or the future that our
Kids.
our children, grandchildren, or our friends, or whoever, whatever your life looks like, if you know, that the future generations have, it's like an investment in that, and having a longer view, it helps it feel less chaotic and terrible.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, change is messy. Like growth is hard, but without it, what are we doing? Right. I mean, that's what I'm always like, what are we doing here? I don't know. We got to do something.
What are we doing here?
What are we doing here?
But I wanted to ask you, Steph, what are you feeling like culturally that you're seeing? What's the vibe? What are people looking for in 2023?
Well, okay. I actually think this is like the one thing that I keep coming back to over and over again that gives me hope. So I'm going to share it because maybe then you can come back to it. But I'm like abolish all of the systems type of person, and I have always been that way, and I'm very much the like black sheep of my family in that way. Like my family's like pretty conservative and whatever. Anyways, I lived with my brother in the pandemic.
Is complicated.
Yeah. But I lived with my brother and his wife in the pandemic. They were kind enough to let me, and I didn't have anywhere to go. It was like when they cut down the borders, and then even still I was like so afraid to be on my own because I have incredibly complicated mental health issues that were getting like really inflamed at that point. So I was living with my brother, and we would have all these conversations because it was like when protests were happening with like Black Lives Matter, and the world is seeming very scary and chaotic, and we didn't go outside much. So we spent all of this time in the house together and in his backyard, having these really hard conversations. And it wasn't that we hadn't had them before, but it was that he like wasn't listening, and he like self-identified that, and he like legitimately voted differently for the first time.
Aww.
And like has changed the way he talks about certain things and the language that he uses and like the way he listens when like even his wife is talking. And to me, that is such a beautiful thing, because as much as I'm someone who's like, I have to go to all the protests and do all of the things and like, invest in my communities in this way, I don't most days believe that there's impact that happens from that. I believe that we have to do it so that those movements stay strong and like we feel like supported in them and whatever, and raise awareness and bring more people into them. But it was such a clear example of like having a conversation with someone and like, as you said earlier, Rebecca, like taking down that wall that sort of separates them from other issues and actually seeing that it made a difference. And I think about that literally all the time. Like, I'm like, if that happened with one person, think of the change that can happen. Like, I have goosebumps right now because I'm like, I don't know, in love with that example.
No, it's beautiful.
So that gives me hope, and everyone else can take that little piece and bring it with them for hope.
I love that.
Yeah.
We have we made a show with a great progressive organizer called George Gale, and it was called To See Each Other. It came out before the 2020 election, and he was basically like, please don't give up on rural peoples in America. Like, hey, blue city folks, like, no. And one of the main tenets of his work as an organizer is about this. It's about deep listening. And there's a lot of academic studies that show that versus like knocking on a door and asking one question, having like a 15-minute conversation where you deeply listen allows for change in people's perspective and ultimately politics. And in it's like a 95% difference. It's something outrageous.
Yeah.
Like, and so it's very real and very impactful and very hopeful to me. Thank you, Steph. And thank you to your brother for listening. And we're not mad that he didn't listen before, because now he did listen.
Yeah. And I do think, I mean, just to go to technology for like a quick aside, I do think, a lot of people, it's hard to have those like deep conversations because we just want to yell over each other. Like,
Correct.
I just want to be like, just abortions are good, like that end of fucking story, like stop talking, I want to do that. And it's hard to not get to that place when you're like having like a long conversation with someone and trying to like understand their point of view and like bring in your own. But one thing that also happened in the pandemic that is kind of hopeful that is carrying through is that we're like interfacing virtually, which I know created a lot of distance for people. But I do also think it slowed us down in a way where like we can't physically talk over each other. Like if we start fighting in this Riverside recording, like it's not going to work. I won't be able to hear you. You won't be able to hear me. I won't be able to hear myself. And like that is kind of a cool thing. Like it has forcefully made people, you know, sit and wait their turn to speak.
Well, I'm not in Zooms or recordings usually with straight white men, so I defer to someone else to let me know if they actually wait their turns or are listening.
Wait, Robin, I want to know what you're hopeful for in 2023 or what 2023 is the year of. Like, how did you answer that?
Well, my answer was a personal answer. You want to hear that?
Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't about anything dirty. I mean, I could tell that too, but it wasn't.
I mean, yeah.
I mean, sure. No, mine was, I last year was about abundance. And I'm still like, I feel like I'm still living into that because I definitely grew up like as a poor kid. And as I mentioned, with not a lot of like great parenting. And so like I have the other shoe's always going to drop kind of mentality. And so I wanted to believe that, you know, money will be plentiful, opportunities will be plentiful. But what I came up with, it took me like 20 minutes to get to it, but I came up to, I want 2023 to be the year of inevitability. And what I meant by that was that, of course, it's coming to me. It's an extension of abundance, but like I'm good enough, I'm worthy. And it's not just a question of like, I'm going to show up and I have a chance. It's like, no, things are going to come. They are coming. It's inevitable. And I'm living into it versus hoping. And like, I think hope's a very powerful tool, but I also think declaring can be even more powerful. And so I'm declaring it's coming.
It sounds like you have you're like a confident abundant.
Yeah.
Like you're like, you've leveled up the abundance.
Yeah.
Wait, is this the new Myers-Briggs?
I've been
You're a confident abundant.
I'm a CA.
I'm gonna add it to my dating profiles quickly.
Yeah, hold on. Yeah, it's on my field.
But I mean, my hope, if I'm taking it back to like what we're talking about, my hopefulness comes that we will listen and talk to one another more, because I have this whole philosophy, and I won't go to the whole thing, but that the loudest voices on the right and on the left are just the fringe, and they're taking up too much space. And they're maybe they're 10% on either side, but the 90% of us who are huddled around the middle need to be talking to each other. Like, like I might be just this side of right and you might be just this side of left, or vice versa. And we need to hear each other and like, and not wait until you're done talking to make my point, but actually hear how these things impact you, so I can hear where you come from. And so you can hear what I know. And I think when you get there, there's compromise can be had. And I think that's where the hope is. Like you've mentioned a couple times the, this hot mess that's happening with the House of Speaker as we're recording. And I have been glued to the TV for 3 days, but not in the way that I was, say, during the Trump era. That was just like a panic. Like this is more just like, I hope that what's going to come out of this is seeing some broken things and more awareness from all of the rational people. And then let's work together. That's my hope. Mm-hmm. I will say this, Rebecca and Amy, this has been, I mean, I feel like I'm speaking for Steph here, but we could talk to you guys for 14 more hours, but
for sure.
I'm not sure anyone wants us to do that. So I'm so thankful that
oh my God. My husband just the other day, he goes, I put on a podcast and I thought of you immediately. And I was like, okay, why? He goes, because it was a 2 hour and 45-minute conversation. And he was like, and I know you would have just reached through that earphones to strangle them.
It's a bit long. But it was just, this was so wonderful. I feel more hopeful having chatted with you guys, but I did want to ask you all to tell our well-adjusted listeners, or I didn't even say the name of my podcast right, the well-adjusting listeners, where they can find all of your content. Oh my, this is how long I've been on break. Where can they find all your content and your social media and your handles and all that jazz? Because we all would need to be following you and involved in what you're doing.
Well, you can listen to the Mashup Americans podcast, of which Grief Collected is our 7th season, I believe, of our show, anywhere you listen to podcasts. So Grief Collected or the Mashup Americans. You can search for either of those. You can also find a beautiful website that we made for Grief Collected, which has tons of resources, white papers, a bookshelf that you can shop from. All the transcripts, all of the tidbits from the show are on there. That's griefcollected.com. You can also find us anywhere on social at Mashup American. We have our website also, mashupamericans.com. And we also have a weekly newsletter, which you can sign up for.
Wait, also, this is now too many CTAs, but speaking of joyful, hopeful things, we made a rom-com, audio rom-com.
Oh, we did.
In 2022. And
It's called Love and Norebang.
it is currently like the iHeartMedia Awards nominated for Podcast of the Year next to like Conan O'Brien and whatever the show is with Sean Hayes and Jason Bateman.
Yep.
Smartless. And it's called Love and Norebang. And just in terms of like joy, connection, fun, it has Randall Park as the narrator and he plays Los Angeles. So just Love and Norebang. So that's a lot of things. Basically, griefcollected.com and then Love and Norebang. And between those, you can find all the other good stuff. So
Oh my God, amazing.
And we'll link to all of that in the show notes.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for joining us. This was such a wonderful chat.
Thank you so much for having us.
You. Little twins talking at the same time.
Well Adjusting is an Edit Audio original, exec produced by Steph Colburn and Robin Hopkins. Thank you to Maria Passingham, Kathleen Speckert, and the whole Edit Audio team.
At Cosmopolitan, we're famous for keeping your secrets and for getting to the bottom of your most burning questions. In a new podcast, we're turning our notorious Cosmo confessions into a safe space to talk out all the gory but helpful details of getting through life's weirdest stuff, from toxic in-laws.
The in-laws are going about this the wrong way because that's trash.
To friends with messy finances.
Should you be lending your friends money?
To having crushes on your coworker. Listen to Confessions wherever you get your podcasts. And send us your confessions.